Hey students, Mr. M here. Today I'm going to talk to you about weathering and erosion. First, what is weathering? Weathering is the breaking down and changing of rocks as a result of exposure to the environment, like rain or sleet or waves crashing, something like that. So if I have a large slab of granite just hanging out in nature, and over hundreds and thousands of years the waves of the ocean are crashing onto that rock, then definitely the rock is going to break down into smaller pieces. It's essentially going to change as a result of exposure to its environment. So after rocks are weathered, they're often eroded, and that process of erosion is the transportation of the sediments that have been broken down by weathering. So if you imagine little bits of that granite slab being pounded off of that slab because it's being hit by wave after wave and then being carried away in the ocean to a different location, the act of carrying away that sediment of the granite is erosion. You move it from point A to B. So erosion is all about movement and transportation. The final part of the process is called deposition. So deposition is the dropping off of the sediments that have been weathered and eroded. So to continue my example, those tiny bits of granite, weathered and eroded by the waves, are transported by the ocean currents and eventually get deposited on a coastline many hundreds of miles away. That is deposition, the dropping off of those sediments. Another way to think about this is kind of a quick analogy that just kind of helps me remember the differences between them, is that weathering is like nature's hammer, right? It's Mother Nature's way of taking big bits of rock and smashing them into smaller bits, changing them into something new. Then erosion is maybe something like a dump truck or a pickup truck carrying all the little bits of broken pieces that were weathered from one location to another. And deposition is the dump truck dumping everything into a big pile on the ground. Alright, so for the remainder of this video, we're really going to focus on weathering. Specifically, and we're going to start by looking at the two main types of weathering. The first example we're going to look at is called physical weathering, and I just want to point out that physical weathering is often known as mechanical weathering. They are the same thing, and this is the breakdown of the rocks into sediments, and the key is that without changing their composition, so that this literally is just changing the size and the shape of the rock. So it's the waves crashing against the boulder and breaking it into smaller pebbles that might be rounded, they could be jagged, and it doesn't change the physical properties of the rock. The granite is still granite. It's not changing the rock. So let's dive a little deeper into our physical or mechanical weathering and look at some different examples. We're going to break this into four specific types. We have frost action, exfoliation, abrasion, and root wedging, which, by the way, is also known as ice wedging. There are a lot of different names for it, as you might imagine. This involves ice. Take an area that might be a little bit above freezing temperature during the day, and you get some rain or maybe some melting snow, and you have some water that seeps into the cracks within the rocks. The sun sets and inevitably the temperature drops, and that water freezes into solid ice. Now, as you may already know, when water freezes, it expands slightly and it gets a little bit bigger. So as it expands, it's going to be pushing outwards on the rocks, and it's going to force it to kind of wedge apart. We see examples of this in all sorts of areas where the temperature is a little bit above freezing during the day and then below freezing at night. And in fact, a good example is what we call a pothole. You see this all over the place. You have the road freezes, at night, and the water has seeped into the cracks, and it expands, and slowly it breaks apart the road, and you end up with this big nasty hole in the ground. So the second type would be called exfoliation. And that also occurs with temperature changes, where it gets very hot during the day and very cold at night. The rock itself will actually expand in the cold, and if it happens day after day and night after night, it weakens the outer layer of the rock until eventually, physically or mechanically, it breaks apart, largely as a result of these temperature changes. So abrasion is also another one, which basically is whenever rock grinds against another rock. It comes in many forms, like here in the desert you would see a lot of wind abrasion, where gusts of wind blow grains of sand that crash into other rock, and very slowly, over thousands and thousands of years, it will actually eat away at the rock. Sometimes it's so windy. We see this in the American Southwest. We can also have water or stream abrasion, as little pebbles and sediments are bounced along the bottom of the stream of the water flows, and that it's going to eat away the rock there as well. They're bouncing all over. And I mentioned before, with waves crashing onto rock, this can happen on the coastline too. So the waves will crash along the rock and just slowly eat away. And we also have glacier abrasion, which is, pretty common in the Northwest, and it's where the glaciers just kind of glide downhill, and they're pulling the rock with it, that ice and slush and stuff. Finally, the last type of physical weathering or mechanical weathering we're going to look at is called root wedging, and it's pretty self-explanatory. This is when plant roots actually grow within the cracks of rocks, and the plants grow larger and larger, and they break apart those rocks. So we see examples of this all over the world. It's amazing, how powerful tree roots and plant roots can actually be. They can be so powerful that they actually break rocks apart. Now we're going to look at the second type of weathering, that being chemical weathering. So remember, this is altering or changing the rock as a result of exposure to different substances. Examples of this are oxidization and carbonation. You may have heard this before. It's oxidization is the formation of rust, and this is whenever the element is exposed to oxygen. It has iron in it, and then it turns to rust, and this can happen in the air. And then finally we have carbonation, and carbonation is really interesting. This is responsible for the formation of these fascinating, beautiful limestone caves that we see around the world. There's a lot of them down in Florida, and it's basically when water reacts with different materials in the soil to create a very mild acid. It's a carbonic acid, and it's strong enough that it encounters certain minerals or rocks like calcite or limestone. It will eat away or dissolve that limestone, and we end up getting these underground caverns where there once was a large expanse of limestone. It gets eaten away, and it has all these underground caves. They're really quite beautiful. I've actually dove in them a couple times, but that is a story for another day. So I hope you guys learned something today. If not, go back and rewatch the video. There's a lot of good information. You'll learn about weathering, erosion, deposition, different kinds of weathering. Remember the chemical weathering, the physical weathering, or the mechanical weathering. That's the hammer. So I'll see you next time, guys. Have fun.